Under the scorching sun, 60 flag-draped coffins lay in silence, aligned in a single row. The air itself seemed to pause. Above, a few dark birds cut across the sky before vanishing into the horizon. Crowds filled the square, but no wails could be heard. The grief was too heavy, pressing down on every chest until only silence remained. President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the front, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His face betrayed no emotion, but his clenched fists had turned pale. Those 60 coffins were not just soldiers, they were voices, hearts, the living pulse of the nation. And someone had deliberately tried to silence them. Only days earlier, Western envoys had paraded through the capital, bearing medals, handshakes, and promises of strategic cooperation. Yet when the smiles faded and the doors closed, President Traoré had refused. No awards, no handshakes, no deals. Soon after came the ambush, all swift, coordinated, merciless. This was no accident, it was a message. At 4:38 a.m., near the eastern outpost of Dargoa, where border reinforcements had been quietly built, an attack descended with precision. Within the first 2 minutes, all communications were cut. Surveillance drones were jammed into silence. No distress call escaped the base. By sunrise, 60 young lives had already been taken by the red dust of the frontier. By noon, their bodies were brought back to the capital, each wrapped in the national flag. Along the roads, citizens knelt as the convoy passed. The following day, the entire nation froze. A 3-day mourning was declared. Schools closed across all 13 regions. Television screens no longer carried music or dramas, but displayed the faces of the fallen, each name, birthplace, and age. The youngest was 19, the oldest 38. Most were fathers. All were sons of the land. In those days, every church, mosque, and shrine filled with prayers. But outside those sacred walls, doubt began to take root. 4 days before the bloodshed, Traoré had rejected a U.S. delegation's diplomatic award. It was said to be a routine gesture, but to many, it was theater, bait disguised as honor. In Bobo Dioulasso, inside the courtyard of the Grand Mosque, elders prayed while men outside argued in hushed tones. "So this is the cost," one muttered, pointing at the radio report. "This is what we pay for standing upright." No one answered. At the University of Ouagadougou, students spray-painted walls with a new slogan, "Dignity has a price, and we are paying it." Even the cautious press shifted. The newspaper Le Faso Tribune ran a headline in bold letters, "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still pulls the trigger." And the president, he did not rush to blame. He did not cry out for revenge. Behind the sealed doors of the Guelba presidential palace, he sat in silence, drafting documents, signing orders, redrawing chains of command. One aide described the atmosphere in those hours. It was like a controlled fire. Quiet, but unstoppable. A broken bar. One aide described the atmosphere in those hours. It was like a controlled fire. Quiet, but unstoppable. If you believe the world must hear this fire, don't let it fade. Subscribe now and leave a comment to honor the 60 fallen voices. Together, we carry their names forward. The sun had barely set on the day of mourning when new questions began to surface. Was this tragedy mere coincidence? Or was it punishment? Who had access to the codes that cut the drones? Who knew the rotations of soldiers in the eastern corridor? Who profited from a bleeding Burkina Faso? Across the capital, grief turned to whispers. On the steps of the National Assembly, a black banner hung. They did not die in vain. Yet below the banner, murmurs grew louder. Some said the strike was an accident of timing. Others believed it was sabotage, carried out with knowledge only insider set or foreign hands it could possess. President Traoré remained silent. His silence was not emptiness, it was weight. When he first heard the report of the fallen, he had asked only one question to his chief of operations: "Do we have satellite traces of any foreign aircraft in the last 6 hours?" The answer came not in words, but in lowered eyes. In Bobo Dioulasso, candles flickered through the night as women gathered in courtyards, reciting verses of remembrance. But outside those courtyards, men clenched radios in their hands, their voices edged with anger. Was it worth it? Is this the price of standing tall against the West? At Ouagadougou University, the slogans on the walls multiplied. "Our dignity has a price, and we are paying it." For students too young to fight, the spray paint was their weapon. In the press, even words sharpened like blades. Journalists began to write with a defiance rarely seen. Strategic retaliation. Coordinated message. These were the phrases that appeared in headlines. One editorial dared to declare, "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still holds the trigger." And yet, amidst this storm of suspicion and sorrow, President Traoré did not lash out. He did not call for revenge or beg for international pity. Instead, inside the walled compound of the presidential palace, a different kind of fire was being stoked. Documents were drafted in the midnight hours. Chains of command were redrawn with fresh ink. Officers were reassigned with swift precision. An executive order expanded the strategic command structure. Nothing was spoken aloud, but those close to the president described it as the forging of iron in silence. Controlled fire, one advisor said, burning only where he allowed it. The public hungered for answers. Theories filled the air like dust after a march. Was this a punishment strike? If not by the West itself, then by those armed and funded by Western powers, who dared to remind Burkina Faso of its vulnerability. And deeper still, what did this say about Africa's place in the theater of global power? Traoré did not feed the speculation. He neither accused nor excused. When he finally spoke, it was not a speech of mourning. It was a directive: build the wall. We are not here to bury heroes. We are here to protect the living. Those words moved faster than fire across dry fields. Within hours, logistics teams began moving drone fabrication equipment eastward. Factories once idle sparked back to life. Engineers worked under harsh lights, sketching prototypes for defense that would not depend on foreign hands. This was not the language of revenge, it was preparation. Foreign embassies sent their condolences, predictable letters, perfumed with diplomacy. Some were read aloud in Parliament, others left unopened. Traoré walked past the pile of envelopes without slowing his step. At the window, he looked out onto the silent streets of Ouagadougou and whispered to his chief of protocol, "Tell them, Burkina Faso does not mourn with permission." There would be no symbolic wreaths, no staged press conferences, no theater of pity. The people did not need sympathy, they needed a plan. That evening, under heavy escort, Traoré visited an abandoned industrial facility on the outskirts of the capital, a forgotten warehouse from the Sankara era. The gates groaned as they opened for the first time in decades. Dust hung heavy in the air. Under flickering overhead lights, the president placed his hand on cold steel beams, then turned to the engineers waiting in silence. His voice carried the weight of the fallen. "We build here, we build now, and we build with our own." 3 days later, the first shipment of composite shells for unmanned aerial vehicles arrived. No imports, no foreign experts, just Burkina Faso copyright hands, Burkina Faso copyright soil, Burkina Faso copyright will. This was not vengeance, this was deterrence. A broken bar, his voice carried the weight of the fallen. "We build here, we build now, and we build with our own." Why do you stand with this resolve? Share your thoughts below and subscribe so that their sacrifice is not forgotten. Let your words be part of the wall of resistance. By the third day of national mourning, the streets of Ouagadougou no longer echoed only with grief. Something new stirred, something heavier than tears of resolve. Posters of the fallen soldiers remained untouched, but beside them, new images appeared. Schematics of drones, maps inked with red borders, training schedules posted in public halls. It was no longer just remembrance, it was preparation. President Traoré unveiled what he called Operation Kalpelgoa, a program unlike anything in Burkina Faso's modern history. Its purpose was simple: transform grief into discipline, and a nation into its own defense. Across the country's 13 regions, community halls became readiness centers. Former teachers began drilling communication codes. Farmers trained as scouts, learning to track movement across terrain they had walked since childhood. Retired hunters taught young recruits how to read the wind, how to move through forests without leaving a trace. This was not conscription, it was a mindset. Enhanced radar systems were ordered, redesigned to detect low-flying threats in rural zones. Algorithms were written by local university students. Young minds that once studied equations now programming survival. In Jibo, software students drafted code for thermal drones. In Fodingerma, carpenters converted their guild warehouse into a training ground. The nation became a web. Every school, every village, every household a node. When reporters asked Traoré if this was revenge, he shook his head. "This is not retaliation," he said calmly. "This is recalibration. If we wait for permission to defend ourselves, we have already surrendered." His words struck chords deeper than politics. In the western town of Banfora, a retired colonel reviewed the new training curriculum and whispered to a journalist, "This is not about revenge. This is about memory, turned into muscle." Within the first week, more than 4,000 civilians registered for local defense education. In Ouahaguya, mothers stitched camouflage into school uniforms. In Tama, elders mapped old caravan routes and taught boys how to walk them in darkness. At a school in Kaya, 60 trees were planted, each one named for a fallen soldier. Beside every sapling, a plaque read, "You fell so we may rise." Children watered them with trembling hands, whispering the names of men they had never met. Traoré visited one of these schools without announcement. Students lined up stiffly, their faces both shy and proud. A young girl stepped forward and handed him a folded slip of paper. Inside, in blue ink, was a poem. "We do not learn history to remember pain. We learn it to name our enemies." He folded the paper slowly, looked into her eyes, and answered softly, "Then name them well. And never forget to name yourselves first as guardians." The program spread like wildfire. Each region of Burkina Faso received direct funding, bypassing bureaucracy. Red zones were mapped digitally, supply routes redrawn. Former textbooks were rewritten into manuals of survival. The Ministry of National Security was restructured overnight. Recruits were no longer judged by brute strength alone, but by adaptability as surveillance, communications, coding, literacy. Soldiers of the future were not just fighters, they were thinkers, builders, watchers. Cultural life shifted too. Musicians and Betrayal de copyright turned protest songs into new anthems. In Betrayal de copyright, dancers choreographed resistance performances modeled on battle formations. Griots, keepers of oral tradition, gathered around fires and transformed mourning into chant. One griot's voice rose above the others. "When the nation bled, cowards ran. But the brave turned songs into spears." What was happening in Burkina Faso was no longer simply military mobilization. It was cultural awakening. Traoré's message spread not only through the barracks, but into kitchens, schools, markets, mosques, and fields. His directive was not just defend, it was prepare. In the dust of village squares, blacksmiths sharpened tools not for trade, but for readiness. In carpenters' shops, benches were cleared to assemble drone shells. In lecture halls, equations were no longer abstracted, they were blueprints for radar systems. It was as if every citizen had been given a role, every village a mission, every soul a duty. And still, on the walls of the capital, the faces of 60 young men remained. Their eyes did not look down in sorrow. They stared outward, steady, as if reminding their country, "We did not fall in vain." Underscore a broken bar. Their eyes did not look down in sorrow. They stared outward, steady, as if reminding their country, "We did not fall in vain." 48 hours after the coffins were lowered into the red soil, a gray, unmarked military aircraft descended quietly onto the runway at Bobo Dioulasso airstrip. No flags painted on its tail, no fanfare to announce its arrival. The ramp dropped, and 11 men in black tactical uniforms stepped out. Russian special operations instructors. They did not bring medals. They did not arrive with promises wrapped in conditions. They came to work. President Traoré had not begged for their assistance. He had not dispatched envoys to Moscow or pleaded at foreign summits. His terms had been clear: they come on our conditions, or they do not come at all. One senior aide later recalled the moment in the war room. The president stood, straightened his jacket, and said, "This is our land. If Russia wants to support Africa, they will do it with dignity or not at all." From the third day onward, joint drills began. Russian instructors moved seamlessly with Burkina Faso's elite units at training in urban counter-strikes, drone interception, remote border warfare. Manuals were translated into French overnight. The chain of command remained entirely under Burkina Faso de copyright sovereignty. No mercenaries, no foreign flags, no hidden contracts, just cooperation, calculated, mutual, respectful. The West noticed. Embassies in Ouagadougou issued statements of concern. Think tanks in Paris and Washington rushed to circulate memos titled "Russia's Advance into Sahel." Headlines buzzed with anxiety, Burkina Faso drifting toward extremism. But inside the country, no one was panicking. They were preparing. President Traoré announced the bold restructuring of national defense, soon whispered across barracks from Ouagadougou. I told the copyright why. The African doctrine of retaliation. It rested on three uncompromising pillars. 1. Total defense sovereignty and no more foreign bases, no outsourced command, no borrowed intelligence. Every defense system must be built locally, trained natively, deployed independently. 2. Strategic disruption, a resistance not only against military invasions but against digital surveillance, economic pressure, and diplomatic coercion. Retaliation would not be limited to the battlefield, it would extend into the boardroom and the airwaves. 3. Civic militarization, not conscription, but a culture. Every citizen trained, every school a knowledge base, every village a node in the defense web. This was not theory. It was doctrine forged in blood. A Russian instructor, speaking anonymously to local press, said, "I've worked in Syria, Ukraine, the Caucasus, but here it is different. You do not just see soldiers, you see an entire population standing alert." At a new joint operations facility on the outskirts of Tankatago, Traoré addressed Burkina Faso copyright officers and their Russian counterparts. His voice was calm, steady. "We are not assembling weapons for aggression, we are assembling discipline. If you aim a drone at our people, we will aim resilience back at you." In Europe, analysts debated. In Washington, the Pentagon flagged Burkina Faso's satellite data for weekly reviews. But in Kaya and Goram, children painted murals of Traoré standing beside armed farmers and young students clutching laptops. Across the copyright, Grotz composed new chants of resistance. It was no longer about military tactics, it was about clarity, and clarity was contagious. Observers from Mali arrived to study Burkina Faso's new drone command protocols. Niger dispatched cyber officers to learn encryption techniques from Burkina Faso copyright engineers. In a closed-door trilateral session held near the Sahel border, the first joint policy draft for a Sahelian defensive union was signed. Its title was simple, uncompromising, the wall of resistance. Traoré did not merely inspire movement, he institutionalized it. From satellite-resistant bunkers to war literacy lessons in schools, from local training hubs to algorithmic surveillance, he wove a tapestry of collective defense. One not born of fear, but of foresight. Orders did not come with drums or banners, they came quietly, with conviction. In a northern village near Zanirat copyright, an old blacksmith sharpened his tools at dawn, not for cattle, not for trade but for readiness. 9 schoolboys arrived with scraps of metal and asked him to teach. "We're ready to learn," they said softly. Elsewhere, Grotz gathered around fires, chanting verses that once carried history but now carried warning. A poet named Madiatil copyright stood and declared, "When the nation bled, the cowards fled, but the brave picked up songs, and turned them into spears." Burkina Faso's message had spread beyond soldiers, it had passed through ministers, over airwaves, into streets, homes, and hearts. Traoré's directive was simple, don't just mourn, prepare. And so the people did. Every guild, every family, every villagea found their role. Every action became a thread in the larger weave of survival. This was not vengeance, this was vision. A broken bar. Every action became a thread in the larger weave of survival. This was not vengeance, this was vision. If you believe vision must be shared, help spread it. Subscribe now, write your thoughts in the comments, and join a community that refuses to kneel. As the dust of mourning settled, the battle moved from the fields to the economy. Western states, alarmed by Burkina Faso's defiance, began tightening the screws. Aid was frozen, visas cancelled, infrastructure projects suddenly suspended. Consultants from Paris and Washington boarded flights home. Inside a late-night cabinet session, an advisor warned, "They've begun cutting bilateral aid. It's retaliation." President Traoré didn't blink. "Then we retaliate with independence." The very next morning, the Ministry of Finance quietly released a confidential roadmap to national banks. Trade dependencies were charted, foreign reserves relocated, and discreet talks opened with Chinese negotiators for liquidity guarantees. Burkina Faso was no longer playing the old game, it was rewriting it. Together with Mali and Niger, Traoré convened a secret summit. 3 flags rose over a closed compound. The outcome was unveiled not with apology but with steel, the salient wall of resistance, a union not of defiance, but of clarity. Standing beside his salient counterparts, Traoré pointed to a map behind him and said, "This is not just territory, this is ideology. We are not forming a bloc of defiance, we are forming a union of clarity." At home, the momentum deepened. Phase 1 of a salient currency framework was launched, a gold-backed regional reserve designed to cut reliance on the CFA franc and euro markets. Commissions were formed to audit infrastructure contracts, highways, hydroelectric plants, rail lines. If foreign-owned, they would be reviewed. If exploitative, they would be reclaimed. "Let them accuse us of nationalism," Traoré told his energy minister. "Better that than submission." Across Café Tilde copyright S and Ouagadougou, the question shifted. No longer, what is the West saying? Instead, what is Traoré planning next? Culture, too, became a battlefield of liberation. Schools revised their curricula to include modules on fiscal sovereignty. Cultural centers screened documentaries on non-aligned nations. In Sorgo, elders reminded youth how Burkina Faso had once survived without IMF handouts. Artists sharpened their voices. Musicians turned protest lyrics into national hymns. Dancers choreographed performances modeled on resistance formations. Cartoonists sketched viral images of Western diplomats losing at a poker table, shocked to find Burkina Faso folding their currency but raising a coalition. In Kaya, schoolchildren planted 60 freedom trees, one for each fallen soldier. Beside each sapling, a plaque read, "You fell so we may rise." Lessons no longer ended with rote memorization, but with chants. We stand, we defend, we remember. When Traoré visited one of these schools, a young girl handed him a folded note. Inside, a poem read, "We do not learn history to remember pain, we learn it to name our enemies." He folded the paper carefully, looked her in the eye, and replied, "Then name them well. But never forget to name yourselves first as guardians." The international media grew uneasy. Yesterday they had called him daring, today they called him reckless, even dangerous. Policy writers at London and Washington in concern, is Burkina Faso drifting into extremism? But inside the country, no one was drifting. They were digging in. Griots by Firelight declared, "This is not revenge, this is memory, sharpened into discipline." Farmers turned fields into training grounds. Carpenters built drone shells. Coders encrypted communications. Grandmothers sewed camouflage into ceremonial robes. This was no longer about 60 men lost in a dawn ambush. It was about a continent rediscovering its breath, and the message spread far beyond borders. Mali and Niger dispatched observers. Chad watched closely. Across Africa, whispers grew into questions. Is independence truly dangerous or merely inconvenient for those who profit from obedience? President Traoré became more than a head of state. He was the living pulse of a movement, one that refused to bow, refused to beg, refused to forget its dead. He walked among farmers, mechanics, students, poets. They did not cheer him with empty applause. They prepared with him in silence. And as the world's analysts scribbled memos and diplomats exchanged cautious statements, the people of Burkina Faso wrote something else: murals, chants, poems, curricula, trees in the ground. They were not waiting for permission to dream. The African doctrine of retaliation was no longer just military strategy. It was a mirror held to the continent, a reminder that dignity demands discipline, and sovereignty demands sacrifice. From the ashes of betrayal, an awakening had begun, and now the question spread like a drumbeat across the silent beyond. Will this ripple become a wave? Will Africa write its next chapter in its own ink? To the people, Traoré's words echoed like a vow. We are not here to bury heroes, we are here to protect the living. And under the shadow of 60 freedom trees, a new Africa whispered back, we will never kneel again. If this story moved something inside you, if it reminded you of what dignity, memory, and freedom mean, then don't let it fade in silence. Subscribe now, share this voice, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Together, we carry the legacy of the fallen, and together we rise for an Africa that will never kneel again.